Talking about Bessie, the story of aviator Elizabeth Coleman. Written by Nikki Grimes and illustrated by E.B. Lewis. Bessie Coleman was born in Atlanta, Texas, at a time when segregation, with its Jim Crow laws and racist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, was a way of life in the South, and lynchings of African American men were commonplace. So-called separate but equal schools did little to prepare African American children to compete in the worlds of business and academics because many whites considered African Americans to be mentally inferior, and the descendants of African slaves were only expected to be field hands or factory workers. As a result, there was little talk of technology in the cotton fields of Bessie's world. Certainly, in 1892, when Bessie was born, few African American people even dreamed of mastering machines that could fly. Bessie was 11 years old when Orville and Wilbur Wright made the first successful airplane flight near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina on December 17, 1903. The flight took place on a narrow strip of sand called Kill Devil Hill, 1,000 miles from the Texas cabin where Bessie lived. Yet the lives of Bessie and the Wright brothers are forever linked. All were pioneers in the field of aviation. Airplanes were widely used in airstrikes during World War I. But after the war, civilians had no use for the machines or the pilots who had flown them. Several years would pass before planes were used to transport passengers. Until then, pilots who wished to earn a living flying resorted to performing death-defying stunts, hundreds of feet above the ground at outdoor circuses. These stunts, or aerobatics, required special skill, steady nerves, split-second timing, and great physical strength, for with each roll, loop, or nosedive, the pilot had to fight the natural force of gravity. There was no room for failure because failure often meant death. Not surprisingly, these barnstormers, as they were called, were known for their daring. One of the most daring and dazzling of them all was Elizabeth Bessie Coleman. The form of the following story is fictional, but the story itself is based on fact. Somewhere on the south side of Chicago, in a private parlor, 20 souls gathered to mourn the death of Bessie Coleman and share their memories of her. Many more had come to the house earlier that evening, but they are long gone. The grandfather clock reads 12:01 a.m., but no one seems to notice that one day has just slipped quietly into another. Bessie eyes the gathering of family, friends, and acquaintances from her place in the photo on the mantel behind them. "Hello, Mama," she whispers. Susan Coleman snaps her head around toward the mantel. She listens for a moment, but there is only silence. Finally, she shakes her head and turns her attention to her ex-husband George, who has started to speak. George Coleman. I remember that bone-chilling January day in 1892 when Bessie's first cry raised the roof off that dirt floor cabin back in Texas. Our 10th child was of a fighting spirit, and though 4 Coleman babies flew to glory soon after their arrival, I knew of the 13 born, Bessie would survive. When she turned 2, we moved to Palmer Road near Mustang Creek in Waxahachie, Texas, where cotton was still king. The 3-bedroom house I built was on a 1/4 acre, bought with back-breaking labor and a careful saving. Few colored men could manage, thanks to Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan. A man of African and Choctaw blood, I was told that hatred was the only reward to expect in life. Oklahoma was better suited to prosperity for such as me, if only my wife had agreed to follow. Of course, Bessie understood none of that. She was just a child then, spending happy days watering roses, weeding where corn, kale, and peanuts grew out back, and molding mud pies after cool spring rains. Sometimes I wish I had stayed. Susan Coleman. I woke my Bessie before dawn on Sundays to bathe and dress her for church, being bound and determined that she, like all my other children, should first learn the wisdom of the Lord and then the wisdom of the world. Bessie got her taste of the second at school after she turned 6. I could neither read nor write, but fixed it so my children would. I weekly pinched pennies to rent books from the library wagon, which come by my house twice a year. Still, near as I can remember, Bessie's first book was the Bible. Each night I tend the oil lamp, then sit while Bessie read the scripture. Her eyes glowed as they moved across the page. She'd stumble over the begats, but mostly she read in a steady voice, pausing between verses to lick her lips as if the words were honey. I cried to see the joy Bessie took in reading. Somehow, I foreknew the grand use she would make of it one day. Willie Coleman. Bessie had no time for foolishness after Papa left. There were 4 of us girls in the house then, plus Mama. Lila and Alberta were long gone, as were John, Walter, and Isaiah, our 3 older brothers, which meant by the age of 9, Bessie was the oldest child at home. Overnight, my big sister became a second mother, who cleaned and swept and cared for us, while Mama kept another's house cross town. Bessie's rag doll rested in a rocker as its owner braced herself to face a spring or summer, fall or winter day of hauling water from the well and mopping floors and making meals atop the old wood-burning stove that warmed our cabin. Bessie's days seemed endlessly tiresome to me, but she just took each one in stride. Field hand. Ain't nobody mentioned how crafty Bessie could be. Not mean-spirited, mind you, just sly. I saw that side of her out in the fields whenever we were working cotton. Bessie despised picking cotton, couldn't even stand the smell, and she'd show it by lagging way behind. Once I even caught her hitching a ride on the back of another picker's sack. Her mama also caught her at it. Of course, Mrs. Coleman let Bessie off scot-free, seeing as how Bessie was the one who kept the family records and tallied the bales of cotton the Colemans picked each day, making sure the foreman paid them their due, and sometimes more. It was an open secret. Now and then, as bales being weighed, Bessie'd accidentally leave her foot lightly resting on the scales, then press down if the foreman chanced to look the other way. Yes, sir, you might could say Bessie bore some watching. School teacher. When it came to knowledge, Bessie was a miser, hoarding facts and figures like gold coins she was saving up to spend on something special. I'd watch her sometimes, poring over her lessons, lips pursed in concentration. Often, when the subject turned to math, she'd glance up at me and I'd swear she'd get a sort of greedy look in her eyes. But maybe it was just my imagination. I did not imagine her persistence, though. Come rain or shine, if work allowed, Bessie would attend the hot in summer, cold in winter, one-room colored schoolhouse where I taught in Waxahachie. Not even the 4-mile walk it took to get there discouraged her from making her way to class. Still, bright as she was, I worried that her fine mind would soon be sacrificed to a life spent picking cotton or working in the mills, like so many others had before. But after each harvest she'd return to class, determined as ever to snatch up and pocket every tidbit of knowledge I could offer. "Teacher," she'd say, "one day I'm going to amount to something." God bless, I did not have fretted in the least. Georgia Coleman. Folks who met Bessie once she left Waxahachie considered her allergic to elbow grease and manual labor. But I recall all the years she took in wash to help out with the bills, and to fill jelly jars with precious pennies toward her education. Laundering was more than just a notion then. Talk about some hard work. Listen, you had to boil clothes in a tub, scrape and scrub them on a washboard in a burning bath of soapy lye that puckered tender skin. Next came the strain of wringing and rinsing and dipping shirts in starch before hanging them in the sun to dry. But your work still wasn't done. You couldn't call it quits till you'd pressed each piece with a red-hot iron, careful not to scorch your fingers. Your good humor could easily dissolve in a week's worth of dirty water. Bessie held her spirits high by saying over and over again, "I won't be doing this forever." Laundry customer. Bessie Coleman? She was a nice enough girl. Polite in her way, I suppose. Goodness knows I couldn't complain about her work. My laundry was spotless, perfectly pressed, always delivered in a timely manner each Saturday, even though my family occupied a mansion in West Waxahachie, about 5 miles from the Collards. Bessie had to walk the distance, I believe, but she managed it. Still, there was something disturbing about her. I think it was her eyes. She never looked down, you know. She'd come to the back door like they were supposed to in those days. But when I opened it, there this colored girl would be standing, looking me straight in the eye, like we were just any two people, meeting on a street in town. You know, just like we were equals. It was odd, I don't mind telling you. Oklahoma drummer. I studied at the Colored Agricultural and Normal University, which was a fancy name for trade school, and believe me, few people there were rich. But Elizabeth, as she then preferred to be called, was amongst the poorest of our class, though not regarding style. At 18 she studied single-mindedly, for she did not plan to be a laundress all her life, or live out her days in Texas as a wife to a tenant farmer. When her money ran out after one semester, I expected to see her show signs of despair. Instead, she simply wrote a letter home saying she'd be returning. Soon after, word came that her church had planned a homecoming party to ease her disappointment. Her having quit school so early must have been a blow. Yet, out of nowhere, Bessie got the idea to take the school band back to Waxahachie with her to provide the entertainment. Well, you never saw so much grinning and hand-clapping and parading as Bessie did that day at Missionary Baptist Church. Only Bessie could turn defeat into a day of celebration, and delight in being the star of the show besides. Willie Coleman. My sister wasn't one to take a thing at face value, especially not thought or word or deed to do with race. Uncle Tom's Cabin was among Bessie's favorite books, and she made it one of ours through her lively reading, miming a preacher's style so perfectly we'd be in stitches. But I recall, after her first recital, she hotly announced, "I'll never be a Topsy, or an Uncle Tom." She had no respect whatever for the slave girl Topsy, who seemed incapable of self-improvement, or for Tom, who had too little race pride for Bessie's taste. She had no use for either, not when it came to picking role models, anyhow. Bessie's habit of probing others' words came, I suppose, of studying those written by Booker T. Washington and Paul Laurence Dunbar. Sometimes I wondered how far their words would take her. By 23, she discovered a newspaper from Chicago which boasted of a better life up north and featured stories of powerful women of the race, writers, business tycoons, and civil rights workers, like Ida B. Wells, Madam C.J. Walker, Mary Church Tyrrell, full of hope and headstrong women, like Bessie. She'd often wake me up at 3 a.m., burning to discuss some new topic or report about our people she had just read. I heard the wheels turning in her head long before that northbound train rolled through Texas and carried her away. Walter Coleman. My little sister was born for Chicago. In no time, Bessie seemed to fit right in with the equally proud and stylishly dressed ladies and gentlemen of the South Side, who filed through Jesse Binga's bank at lunchtime, or sauntered by the office of the Chicago Defender, or paraded in and out of countless other Negro businesses bordering the stroll. She loved the salons and haberdasheries, restaurants and bars, and the nightclubs like Dreamland, where Louis Armstrong blew all our blues away. She'd come north by my invitation, though she'd always had a mind to leave the limits of the South. "You can't make a racehorse of a mule," our mother used to say. "If you stay a mule, you'll never win the race." Bessie planned on winning, if only she knew what. Each year she searched for one trade or career that might best suit her, never knowing what that vocation was or what it might lead her to. I don't understand how Bessie kept her focus fixed, but however long it took, she meant to find a lifelong work of substance, to prove herself and make her people proud. Racehorse or not, Bessie had a lot in common with a mule. John Coleman. World War I left me with nightmares and a fondness for drink, though neither gave me an excuse for teasing my sister. Still, I goaded Bessie about going to the Burnham School of Beauty Culture, and being overeager to avoid hiring herself out as a domestic, but she just shrugged, said she'd had enough of that kind of work back home. She got a job buffing men's nails at a high-class barber shop on the Stroll, where I'd drop in to swap war stories and talk politics with her customers. I'd point out that she was still a common laborer after a lifetime of telling anyone who'd listen that she'd amount to something big someday. She'd worked in the shop 5 years, and I wandered in one afternoon, blabbing about airplanes and French women who had real careers as pilots, when I turned to Bessie and joked, "You Negro women ain't ever gonna fly, not like those women I saw in France." The barber shop rocked with laughter. Then I heard this snap that was so familiar. It was that steel-trap mind of Bessie's. "That's it," she said. "You just called it for me." She gave up her manicuring job that very day. That's when I knew, by whatever miracle was required, Bessie would learn to fly. Robert Abbott. Bessie's copper color gave the truth of her away, for at the core she, though slight in appearance, was as tough as any metal, and always ready and willing to test her strength. That much was clear the day she strode into my office to talk about her future and the future of our people. She was 27 then, and planned to be the first colored woman in the world to fly. The problem was, no flight school in our color-minded nation would accept a woman, or a Negro. She asked for my help, since I, too, had once been driven by a dream to lift the race. I founded my newspaper on nothing less. "Go to Paris," I advised. "French flyers are the best. They'll teach anyone, in French, of course." Much to her credit, Bessie didn't even blink. I told her of a language school on Michigan Avenue. Next thing I knew, Bessie had enrolled. For 1 year she studied French and worked in a chili parlor to save toward the aviation school I found for her in France. I helped her buy passage on the SS Imperator and said the Defender would promote her cause and record her success once she returned with pilot's license in hand. It was 1920, and Bessie was news, you understand. As a publisher, I considered her a wise investment. When Bessie boarded the steamer that icy November, she became a front-page story in the making. Classmate. Jaja, she knew a little French, but my English was better. We would speak together often, for Bessie was lonely. In a graduating class of 62, she was the only woman, and the only black as well, at the Codron School of Aviation. Ground school was where our training started, and Bessie always raced to find a seat up front. She wanted to be close enough, she said, to catch each new word, and there were many, like cowlings, struts, joystick, rudder bar, all parts of the biplanes we would later learn to fly. Our heads were filled with principles of flight, and we were drilled on cloud formations, wind, weather, and what effect each one might have on takeoff and landings. I'd grow dizzy watching Bessie furiously scribble notes. Sometimes she would smile and gaze out the window at the wondrous man-made birds of wood and wire silently waiting to lift her up and up into the endless blue over Paris, and she would sigh. I shared her longing, but not her love for the complex equations we had to learn, calculating plane weight plus distance, and figuring out how much fuel we would need for each flight, and what the takeoff speed should be, depending on what the pilot weighs, of course. Juggling such a lot of facts and figures gave me headaches, but Bessie hummed sweetly, and puzzled out each problem without complaint. I asked her once to please explain how it was possible for her to find such difficult work enjoyable. "As a child," she said, "I always was good at math, but now I'm glad to discover that there was all along a higher purpose for my skill than counting bales of cotton." "What is a bale?" I asked. Bessie threw her head back and laughed. Flight instructor. Mais oui, she was a beauty. A 27-foot angel with a 40-foot wingspan, the Newport 82, an old and trusted friend I introduced to students. But I warned Bessie, as I cautioned everyone, if she continued her course, the Newport could be the last old friend on whom she ever laid her eyes. One day, Bessie learned precisely what I meant. The Newport climbed to 2,000 feet, then leveled off, purring perfectly, until the engine quit. The roar died suddenly away, and soon the plane was falling as the wind screamed past. 100, 200, 300 feet it fell, then snapped into a roll. Wedges of earth and sky flashed by too fast for memory as the plane hurtled, then slammed to the ground with student and teacher on board. Bessie gasped, watching from the sidelines, knowing how easily she could be the one in flames. I was surprised the next day when she came for her lesson, how she boarded the plane without hesitation. I signaled directions above the wind and engine roar. She moved the rudder bar and joystick as I told her, practicing until her rhythm was steady and sure. "The crash was a terrible shock to my nerves," she later said, "but I never lost them." News Reporter 1. It was a crisp autumn day when this reporter and others gathered at the New York docks to meet the SS Ventura from France, there to greet the world's first colored aviatrix who was on board. The lovely lady had traded in blouse and skirt for a French-cut pilot's uniform and had ordered a Nieuport scout plane to be built for her in Paris, or so she said. Miss Coleman, I understand, gave exhibition flights while in Europe, though I have no proof of such. They applauded me wildly in Berlin for my daredevil skills, she said. In Munich, too. A reporter I knew from the Chicago Herald offered to report her story, provided she would agree to pass for white. However, her only response to his offer was laughter. In this reporter's humble opinion, the Herald was the loser, for Bessie was a spellbinder. She spoke with eyes and hands and sweeping gestures. She drew pictures in the air, and made the listener believe he was there, right inside her story. Bessie Coleman, aviatrix, could easily have been a great actress off the stage. Willie Coleman. My sister-in-law should have been a writer, since she was always telling tales. Enhancing the truth was her specialty. Drumming up publicity, she called it. Hear her tell it. She was bosom buddies with the Red Baron, had flown a German seaplane, and was near about born with wings. Told the New York Times she went to France with the Red Cross during the war, and that she had one of them brigade officers teach her how to fly. Now you tell me if that ain't stretching the truth. Bessie was only 5'3", but she made herself out to be bigger than life. Who she thinks she was impressing? The kids, maybe. I seen 'em flock to her. They'd sit round her for hours listening to her stories. She spoiled 'em, too. Bought 'em toys, gave 'em spending money from what little she had. She cooked up fancy meals for her nephews and nieces, made 'em think she was something special. Quiet as I kept, I guess she was. But them dressed-up tales she told, they hurt more than helped, if you ask me. Made it harder for folks to believe the plain truth of what she really did, which was plenty. Her causing folks to think otherwise was nothing but a shame. News reporter number 2. In 1922, I knew I was in the presence of royalty when Bessie appeared on that Long Island airfield. Queen Bess had no throne, of course, unless it was a cockpit of a plane. But we of the press were there and to share in whatever glory came her way. She received less fanfare and opportunity to profit from her skill than she deserved. While Amelia Earhart found sponsors easily enough, Bessie had a tough time finding companies to fund her exhibitions or hire her to advertise their wares. Even pilots have to earn a living. Bessie was not entirely alone in her pursuit. We of the Defender helped to spread her name. And though it took a year, we arranged her first public flight in America, and what a sight she was. The gritty and progressive woman who had once worked cotton, striding regally in uniform and goggles, waving to us, her royal subjects, who showered her with applause. Our queen flew a borrowed plane that afternoon, a humbling necessity, for the company made her fly once around the field with another pilot to test her skill before allowing her to fly alone. I groan at the memory of that insult even now, but Bessie accepted it in silence, with grace. A mere 3,000 were in attendance for that performance, proof that too few of us understood the wonder of the moment or the woman. But I still read and wrote reports of lynchings, and was forced to ride in colored-only railroad cars. I knew how far Bessie had brought us all. None that mild September day applauded more loudly or proudly than I. All hail Queen Bess. Saks is the name, Coast Tires is the game. We paid Bessie a fee to mention our company during her interviews, making full use of her as a celebrity. I knew her personally, was honored to be one of the students she taught to fly, and am especially proud to say that our firm helped Bessie purchase her first plane. For the money, I preferred to deal with a person who knows her own mind, and that was Bessie. By the time we met, she knew precisely what she wanted, to start a school of aviation in America where Negroes could learn to fly. That was her greatest dream, and owning a plane would help her move one step closer to it. She bought herself an old Army surplus plane and arranged an exhibition at Paloma Park in Los Angeles. 10,000 gathered for the event, but it was not to be. On the way from Santa Monica to the airfield, Bessie's engine stalled 300 feet above the ground. The sound of the crash was heard for miles. For 3 months she lay in a hospital, impatient for her broken bones to knit, though unwilling to quit the sky, for she believed our people could and should succeed in the world of aviation, and she wouldn't give up until she had convinced us of it. I visited her during the difficult recovery. She just smiled through the bruises and bloody bandages, painfully propped herself up in bed, and whispering, ordered me to spread the word. Tell 'em all, as soon as I can walk, I'm going to fly. Young Fan. You should have seen her. She made her plane do spirals and fancy flips, and made the plane quit mid-air and let it zoom down like when she crashed in California. And just when we thought she was surely done for, she pulled the plane up again and tore off for the sun. Just think, we colored folks almost didn't get to see her, 'cause the air circus is usually whites only. But Bessie told the producers if we couldn't come to the show, she wouldn't either. Her shows were worth so much money, they finally let her have it her way. Folks here in Waxahachie lined up for a chance to fly with Bessie after the show, like folks had done in Houston, Memphis, Richmond, and every other city she'd flown in the last 4 years. I'd have flown with Bessie too, but Ma said girls and planes don't go together. Bessie was 34, which is sorta old, but she was beautiful. One time a film company in Florida was planning on making a movie about her, which was no surprise. Ask me, she was a star already. Bessie gave a bunch of lectures at local churches and theaters to raise money so she could start a flying school. I went to hear her talk at one of them, and I sat in the front row and watched the films she showed of her flying over the Kaiser's Palace in Germany. Her eyes sparkled when she talked of aviation, and she said that we should all think about learning how to fly, especially us girls. I'm anxious to teach you, she said, and I swear she was looking dead at me when she said it. I haven't made up my mind about being a pilot, but Bessie made me believe I could be anything. Reverend Hezekiah Keth Hill. Lord spoke kindly of the eagle and dove, but he also loved the raven. A strong, mysterious black bird of high intelligence is she, a creature slighted by many, but cared for by God. That was Bessie. She stayed with my wife and I at our Orlando parsonage, and there Bessie renewed her faith. For 2 months she called my wife and me Mother and Daddy, her own beloved mother being miles away in Chicago, and her father living in parts unknown. Viola and I were proud to be family to Bessie, however brief the time. I am pleased that she soaked in God's Word while living with us. Many's the hour I found her reading the Psalms, usually by lamplight. She saved the mornings for weeding the vegetable garden out back. Both pastimes, she said, reminded her of happy days in Waxahachie. We loved her as our own, and were warmed to see her often surrounded by children who admired her beauty and her bravery. I prayed constantly for Bessie's safety, and was much relieved when she agreed to end her barnstorming days and promised to rely more on her lectures as a means of raising funds for the school she was bent on building. Her mind was set, she said, on turning Uncle Tom's Cabin into a hangar, where she could, at long last, teach our people how to fly. On the porch one night, Viola suggested Bessie might consider opening a beauty shop for extra money. Bessie liked the idea. She was almost ready to settle down anyway, she said. Trying out the quiet life might be nice. Someday soon. I might have believed it. Lord knows I wanted to. But then, before we went in, I caught Bessie out of the corner of my eye. She looked up at the sky for one last glimpse of blue heaven. Bessie Coleman. I'll never forget that first time in France. My knees wobbled when I climbed into the cockpit. The mechanic cranked the propeller for me, and soon a fine spray of engine oil misted my goggles, baptizing me for takeoff. I taxied down the runway, praying. But flying at Checkerboard Field in Chicago was the best. My family and friends were there in the stands, cheering me on as I sliced through the air. Oh, Mama, I wish you could have been in the plane to feel that magnificent machine shudder with the sheer joy of leaving the ground. I climbed over 1,000 feet that day, did a snap roll that sent the blood rushing to my head so fast I thought my eyes would explode. My seatbelt felt like a magnet pulling on my spine. I can still feel my hand gripping the joystick, how my muscles ached from struggling to hold the plane center, but I didn't mind. To rest, even for a moment, weightless and silent, on a cushion of cloud, near enough to the sun to scoop up a handful of yellow, was a privilege more than worth the price of pain. In the end, I count myself twice blessed. First, to have experienced the joy of flight, and second, to have shared it with others of my race. I'll say this and no more. You have never lived until you have flown. On April 30th, 1926, rehearsing for a show in Florida, brave Bessie sat in the back of her plane while co-pilot William D. Wills took the controls. Her seat belt was unfastened, so that she could lean over the side to choose a landing spot for a parachute jump the next day. Suddenly, the plane went into a nosedive and then a tailspin, tossing Bessie to her death. The plane crashed and Wills also died. The cause of the crash remains a mystery. Bessie was 34 years old. Although she never realized her dream of opening a school of aviation for African Americans, her accomplishments were considerable. She overcame obstacles of poverty as well as racial and sexual discrimination to become the world's first licensed female pilot of African descent. Bessie learned a foreign language and traveled to Europe not once but twice in order to study aviation and develop the special skills needed to perform the aerobatics. She logged thousands of miles across the country as a lecturer to encourage others of her race to enter the field of aviation. She paved the way for other African American pilots, including Arthur W. Freeman, her nephew, and was a forerunner to the African American astronauts such as Dr. Mae Jemison. Among the tributes to Bessie Coleman are the establishment of aviator groups such as the Bessie Coleman Aviators Club of Indiana, the commemoration of May 2nd as Bessie Coleman Day in Chicago, an access road to Chicago O'Hare's Airport named Bessie Coleman Drive, and a commemorative stamp issued in 1995 by the U.S. Postal Service as part of its Black Heritage Series. Bessie Coleman's sturdy faith and determination to reach her goals challenges each of us to push ourselves beyond our limits to pursue our own dreams.